On the morning that Rick Grimes woke up from his coma in a Georgia hospital, he walked out into a world that had ended while he was unconscious. The halls were dark, the bodies were in the corridors, and outside, on the hospital roof, there was a military helicopter. The rotors were still. No one was coming. Rick did not know it yet, but that helicopter told him everything he needed to understand about what had happened while he was asleep. The military had been here. It had assessed the situation. And then, at some point between the day Rick was shot and the day he woke up, it had left. Not been overrun. Not been defeated in battle. Left. What happened in between those two moments, between the arrival of the most powerful military on Earth and the silent helicopter on the roof, is one of the most detailed and tragic stories in the entire Walking Dead universe. It spans the main series, Fear the Walking Dead, The Ones Who Live, and a plan called Operation Cobalt that the show referenced in its very first season and did not fully explain for over a decade. Tonight we are going to walk through the complete story of how the United States military failed. What it tried, what it got wrong, the specific decisions that turned a crisis into a collapse, and what that collapse left behind in the world Rick Grimes eventually woke up into. Get comfortable. This one has a lot of layers. Before we can talk about what the military did wrong, we have to be honest about what it was dealing with, because there is a version of this story, the version you sometimes see in fan discussions, where the military's failure is treated as obviously absurd, where people point to machine guns and tanks and ask how any army loses to slow-moving reanimated corpses. That version misses almost everything important about the actual situation. The Walking Dead's outbreak did not announce itself as a zombie apocalypse. It announced itself as a public health crisis. The wildfire virus, as it is referred to across the franchise, is an airborne and latent viral infection. It does not immediately kill its host. It does not turn people into monsters the moment they are exposed. It lies dormant in every human being on the planet, activated only by death. This is the crucial piece of information that every institution, every government agency, and every military command structure in the Walking Dead world was missing in the opening days of the crisis. The virus had already spread everywhere before anyone knew it existed. The Walking Dead were not an external invader crossing a border. They were a consequence of every human death, regardless of cause, regardless of location, regardless of whether that person had ever been bitten by anything. According to the law established across the franchise, the CDC first identified what would become known as wildfire on April 16, 2010. The virus was traced to a French biomedical laboratory, La Biomédecine D, DMI, and by August 25th, it had been declared a global pandemic by the CDC. But in those weeks between identification and declaration, the information was being tightly controlled. The true nature of the virus, the fact that death itself was now the threat rather than any specific infection vector, was kept from the public. Only government and military officials, members of law enforcement, and emergency services were made aware of what they were actually facing. Think about what that cover-up meant in practice. It meant that ordinary people who lost someone in the early days of the outbreak, who watched a family member die of what seemed like a fever, did not know to prevent that person from reanimating. It meant that hospitals began generating new walkers from every patient who did not survive their underlying condition. It meant that every car accident, every heart attack, every death from any cause, anywhere in the country, was now producing an additional threat with no one in the immediate vicinity prepared to deal with it. The infection did not spread because of bites. It spread through the background death rate of a country of 300 million people. And it spread in silence because the institutions that knew what was happening had decided the public could not handle the information. That cover-up is not a conspiracy in the traditional dramatic sense. It was not a small group of powerful people deciding to sacrifice the population for their own benefit. It was a series of institutional decisions made at various levels of government, each one individually defensible and collectively catastrophic. The CDC restricted information to prevent panic that might accelerate the spread. The Department of Defense received briefings but was operating under the assumption that the public communications would catch up quickly. State emergency management agencies were told enough to begin preparations, but not enough to prepare the public effectively. Every institution was making decisions based on what it knew and what it thought other institutions were handling. And in the gaps between those assumptions, the crisis was compounding. By August 27th, the death toll and the number of walkers had reached critical levels simultaneously. The chaos caused by walkers in densely populated areas, combined with protests and riots triggered by what looked to the uninformed public like police shootings of unarmed civilians, produced a cascade of social breakdown that emergency services could not contain. Road infrastructure began to fail as accidents and abandoned vehicles accumulated. Power grid maintenance became impossible as workers stopped coming in. Communication infrastructure began to degrade, and through all of it, the walkers were multiplying not because they were biting enough people, but because people were dying at the normal rate and getting back up, and the people around them did not know what to do about it. By the time the military was formally deployed, the problem was already orders of magnitude, larger than anything the public health framing had suggested. The military was being sent in to deal with a situation that almost no one at any level of the command structure fully understood, and it was being sent in weeks after the moment when full information, rapid response, might have actually changed the outcome. Once it became clear that local law enforcement could no longer manage the situation, the government declared a state of emergency and deployed the military. In most states, this meant the National Guard in the first instance. In California, which had some of the earliest and densest concentrations of cases, the governor issued a state executive order deploying the Guard to the worst affected areas. The strategy was reasonable given what military planners understood at the time. Establish defensible perimeters in major cities, create safe zones where the civilian population could be concentrated and protected. Use those safe zones as forward operating bases from which the military could run sweeps through surrounding areas, neutralising walkers and reclaiming territory in a systematic, controlled expansion. It is the same basic model that has worked in counterinsurgency and urban pacification operations across decades of modern military history. Secure a base, establish a perimeter, expand it outward. The doctrine is sound. The application to this specific threat was catastrophically wrong. In Los Angeles, the National Guard established 12 fenced safe zones. They set up medical facilities, including a hospital at Raynard Community College. They created refugee centres and attempted to maintain supply lines. This is what we see in Fear the Walking Dead's first season. The Guard trying to hold a line in a city that is rapidly slipping past the point where lines can be held. The show captures the texture of those early days with unusual precision. Soldiers who are visibly exhausted, officers issuing conflicting orders, civilians who do not understand why they are being told to stay inside their neighbourhoods behind chain-link fencing, and beneath all of it, the creeping sense among the Guard's own personnel that what they have been told about the situation does not match what they are seeing with their own eyes. Corporal Andrew Adams, one of the Guard officers depicted in Fear the Walking Dead's first season, is a useful representative of the institutional psychology at this stage. He is not cruel by nature. He is frightened. He is operating under orders that are already becoming incoherent as the situation outpaces the planning. He makes decisions that from a human perspective are monstrous and that from a military institutional perspective are the logical application of the procedures he has been given. The show does not present him as a villain. It presents him as a man whose institution has put him in a position where following his training and doing the right thing are becoming mutually exclusive, and who is choosing the training because the training is all he has left. The safe zone model had one fatal assumption built into it, that the source of the threat was external to the safe zone, that if you could stop walkers from getting in, the people inside were safe. What the model did not account for, because no one had been properly briefed on how the virus actually worked, was that every person inside the safe zone was already carrying the infection. Every person inside that perimeter who died of any cause, whether from a walker attack or from appendicitis or from the pre-existing heart condition they had before the outbreak began, would become a new walker inside the fence. The threat was not outside the walls. The threat was inside every person the walls were supposedly protecting. This is why the safe zones began generating internal walker incidents almost immediately after they were established. Fear the Walking Dead shows this directly. The Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena, one of the larger medical facilities, became overrun from within. Daniel Salazar, one of the show's early survivors, later used the 2,000 walkers trapped inside it to overrun the military hospital, turning the military's own containment infrastructure against it. In a sequence that would be almost poetically apt if it were not so brutal, the military's primary medical facility in Los Angeles was destroyed not by a walker horde from outside, but by a horde assembled from within its own walls. In Georgia, the situation was developing along parallel lines. The safe zone established in Atlanta attracted enormous numbers of civilians who had been directed there by the government's public communications. Those civilians brought with them the normal background human death rate, and each of those deaths generated a new walker inside a space that was already crowded and already under pressure. The military checkpoint Rick passes on his way into Atlanta in the pilot episode is not a fortified position. It is a collection of abandoned vehicles and bodies, the remains of a defensive line that had been in place and then was not. The safe zone model was not a bad plan. It was a plan built on wrong information about the nature of the threat. And in this case, as in most cases involving military planning, wrong information was more dangerous than no plan at all. The military was pouring resources into a strategy that was generating the problem it was designed to solve. And the people making the decisions did not know it was happening, because the people who understood what was happening were not sharing that understanding widely enough or fast enough to change anything. While the safe zones were being established, the United States government was operating under a second catastrophic misunderstanding about the geography of the crisis. As confirmed in the comic series through a conversation Glenn has in an earlier issue, the government believed the virus was coming from outside Atlanta, not from within it. They thought they were dealing with a directional threat, something moving in from an external source that could be contained at a perimeter. This informed where military resources were concentrated and what the response strategy was organised around. The implication of that error is enormous. If you believe the threat is external and directional, you face outward. You fortify the perimeter and you push back. You concentrate forces at the edges of the affected zone to stop the spread. What you do not do is treat the interior of the zone as equally dangerous, because your model of the threat tells you the interior is where the civilians are, not where the enemy is. But the dead do not come from one direction. They are generated everywhere, from every death, from every person who had the bad luck to die while the civilization around them was collapsing. The military was fighting a war it thought was coming from outside the city walls, while the actual war was being generated inside those walls by the people the military was trying to protect. This particular intelligence failure was not the result of incompetence. It was the result of the cover-up. The people who understood what wildfire actually was had not shared that understanding with the people designing the tactical response. The gap between what the CDC knew and what the military's field commanders knew was, in the most literal possible sense, the gap between civilization surviving and civilization collapsing. There is a pattern in the Walking Dead universe where the institutions that are supposed to coordinate in a crisis fail to share critical information with each other, and that failure is not incidental. It is structural. The CDC kept the nature of wildfire secret to prevent panic. The military was deploying to contain a crisis it had been given an incomplete picture of. The government was issuing orders based on models that did not reflect what its own scientists knew. And at every level, the people making decisions were making them in good faith with the information they had, which was systematically less complete than the information that existed. In season 1 of the main series, Doctor, Edwin Jenner shows Rick's group test subject 19, the brain scan of his reanimated wife, and explains for the first time on screen what the virus actually does. A piece of information that should have been distributed to every soldier in every safe zone on day 1 was instead being guarded by a single scientist in an underground facility. That is not a personal failure on Jenner's part. That is the result of a chain of institutional decisions about information control that had already cost millions of lives by the time Rick sat down to watch that scan. There is a reason that Frederick the Great of Prussia said an army travels on its belly, and Napoleon said the 2 things a soldier needs are a full stomach and a good pair of shoes. Modern military operations are extraordinarily resource-intensive in ways that popular culture rarely engages with honestly. A tank, for example, burns through diesel fuel at a rate that makes it effectively useless if its supply chain fails. A military helicopter requires regular maintenance by trained technicians using specific parts that have to be manufactured, stored, and transported from specific facilities. An infantry unit needs food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, communication equipment, and the infrastructure to move all of those things to wherever the unit is operating. Strip away any one of those requirements, and the unit's combat effectiveness degrades. Strip away several simultaneously, and the unit becomes a liability rather than an asset. A group of people who need to be fed and protected, rather than a group of people who can fight and protect. All of that infrastructure depends on the same civilian supply chains that were collapsing alongside everything else in the Walking Dead world. The fuel refineries needed workers to operate them, and those workers were either dying, turning, or abandoning their posts to protect their families. The ammunition factories needed workers. The logistics depots needed workers to run them, truck drivers to move their contents, road crews to keep the roads passable, and communications operators to coordinate the entire network. The military supply chain is not a simple structure. It is one of the most complex logistical systems ever built, and it is deeply intertwined with civilian infrastructure at every level. Power for bases, water treatment, food production, and distribution. Every one of those dependencies ran directly through the collapsing civilian world. As the crisis deepened, as the people who operated those facilities were killed, turned, or fled to protect their families, the military's ability to sustain its operations shrank regardless of how many soldiers it had, or how much equipment those soldiers were carrying. A tank without fuel is a steel box. A helicopter without aviation fuel and maintenance staff is a metal sculpture on a rooftop. An infantry unit without ammunition resupply can engage in exactly as many firefights as its soldiers' individual load capacity allows, and then it stops being a fighting force. The helicopter on the roof of Rick's hospital was not there because the military had been defeated in a tactical engagement. It was almost certainly there because it ran out of fuel, or its maintenance schedule could not be met with the parts and personnel available. Or the pilot received a message over the radio that made staying on the hospital roof a worse option than whatever came next. Military equipment without supply chains is just expensive weight. in a world where weight is a problem. And in the Walking Dead world, the supply chains went down faster than almost any other component of the civilization they were embedded in. Fear the Walking Dead touches on this directly and repeatedly. The guard units in Los Angeles are shown running increasingly thin on resources as the season progresses. Their ability to clear areas, to maintain the perimeters of the safe zones, to project force beyond their immediate positions, is visibly constrained not by any failure of courage or tactical competence, but by the simple fact that the systems keeping them operational are failing in real time around them. Soldiers rationalising reduced rations, vehicles that can't be moved because the fuel allocation has run out, communication equipment operating on batteries that are getting harder to replace. There is also a specific problem that the logistics literature on military operations highlights, and that is directly relevant to the Walking Dead context. Modern military logistics planning assumes a stable rear area. The supply chain can function because there is a zone behind the front line where the infrastructure operates, where the factories run and the trucks move and the maintenance facilities stay open. In the Walking Dead world, there was no stable rear area. The threat was everywhere simultaneously. There was no safe zone for the supply chain itself. Every logistics facility, every ammunition depot, every fuel storage point was as exposed to the crisis as the front lines were. The military was trying to fight a battle with a supply chain that was itself already under attack from the same threat it was trying to contain. This is one of the most realistic elements of The Walking Dead's world building, even if the show rarely lingers on it long enough for the full implications to land. A military does not just fail when it runs out of soldiers, it fails when it can no longer supply and maintain the soldiers it has. And in a world where every logistics worker is a potential walker, and every supply route runs through territory that has no clear perimeter, supply chain collapse is not a slow process. It is very fast and it accelerates as it goes. The military does not function without the chain of command. Orders flow from the top down, from the President to the Secretary of Defence to the Joint Chiefs to the regional commanders to the field officers to the enlisted personnel. Every link in that chain is a person, and every person in that chain was dealing with the same thing during the Walking Dead outbreak that every other human being on Earth was dealing with. Their family was in danger and they were not there. The scale of desertion during the early days of the outbreak, as depicted in Fear the Walking Dead and referenced in the main series, was staggering. Soldiers did not abandon their posts because they were cowards. They abandoned them because the institution they were serving had not prepared them for a situation where following orders and protecting my children were in direct and unresolvable conflict. In most of human history, those two things could be separated. You could serve your country's military and trust that your country's institutions would protect your family while you were deployed. Once the institutions themselves began to collapse, that separation became impossible. The psychology of desertion under these conditions is worth thinking about carefully. A soldier at a safe zone perimeter, watching walkers accumulate at the fence, while rumours circulate that the sector 3 miles away has already fallen, receiving orders that no longer match what his own eyes are telling him, does a continuous private calculation. Is what I am doing here making a difference? Is there a command structure that is going to help me when the fence fails? Are the people who gave me these orders still alive? And if they are, do they know what is actually happening on the ground? And beneath all of those questions, the one that the military cannot train away, because it is written into the deepest parts of human biology. My children are somewhere in this city and I do not know if they are alive. A squad that wakes up to find that 3 of its members have deserted overnight is not just 3 soldiers short. It is a squad that now has questions about whether the remaining members will be there tomorrow, about whether the orders they are receiving reflect a command structure that still exists, about whether the mission they were given still reflects the actual situation on the ground. Morale is not a soft concept. It is a practical military resource, and it was being consumed faster than it could be replenished. Fear the Walking Dead depicts the guards' breakdown in real time. The show's first season is essentially a compressed portrait of how quickly a functioning military unit becomes a collection of individual people making individual survival calculations. The soldiers abandoning safe zones, the officers giving contradictory orders, the breakdown of the relationship between the military and the civilians it was theoretically protecting. These are not dramatic exaggerations. They are the logical consequences of asking human beings to maintain institutional discipline in a situation that was systematically destroying every reason that discipline had been earned and maintained. The cover-up that the government had maintained about the true nature of the virus also had a specific corrosive effect on military morale that does not get enough attention. Soldiers began encountering situations that their briefings had not prepared them for. Dead civilians who did not stay dead. Cleared zones that were not cleared because the clearing operation had generated new walkers from its own casualties. Orders that contradicted observable reality. When the gap between the official narrative and the situation on the ground becomes wide enough, soldiers do not respond by trusting the official narrative more. They respond by trusting it less, by trusting their own judgment and their own immediate survival assessment over whatever the chain of command is telling them. That breakdown of institutional trust is what desertion looks like at the tactical level, and it cascaded through the military's units at every level of the organisation simultaneously. At some point in the chain of command, someone looked at the data, understood what it meant, and made a decision that a functioning military would never have made while it was fully functional. They decided to abandon the civilian population in the safe zones without telling them it was happening. They decided to do it at night quietly so as not to panic the people who were about to be left behind. And they gave the order for the humane termination of infected individuals in the medical facilities before the withdrawal. The operational language in the withdrawal order is itself revealing. Humane termination is a phrase from veterinary medicine, the language used for euthanizing animals. Its use here in military operational orders referring to American civilians in quarantine facilities is a window into the institutional psychology of a command structure that had already stopped thinking of those civilians as the mission and had started thinking of them as a liability to be managed. That shift from "we are here to protect these people" to "these people are a problem we need to contain before we leave" is the moral centre of the military's failure. The tactical and logistical failures were real and serious, but this is the one that was chosen, that was decided by people who knew what they were deciding. That decision, to leave in the dark without warning, is in some ways more revealing than anything else the military did. It is the decision of an institution that no longer believed in its own mission, but had not yet formally admitted that to itself. Operation Cobalt is the name the franchise eventually gave to the military's full response plan. It was referenced by name in Fear the Walking Dead Season 1, when Strand and Daniel Salazar discover the details in the episode titled Cobalt. But the consequences of it were visible much earlier, in the very first season of the main series, and in the Season 2 flashback where Laurie and Shane watch Atlanta burning. The plan had two phases. The initial stage was the safe zone strategy: deploy to cities, establish defensible perimeters, protect civilians, use the safe zones as staging points for reclaiming surrounding territory. When that failed, when the safe zones began generating walkers from within, when the supply chains began to collapse, and desertion began to hollow out the units maintaining the perimeters, a contingency plan was activated. The contingency plan called for three things. First, military units were to withdraw from the safe zones during the night without informing civilians, to avoid panic. This is the moment the military formally abandoned its stated mission. Second, individuals in medical facilities were to be humanely terminated. Third, the cities that had been overrun were to be napalmed from the air. Cities known to have been bombed include Atlanta, Los Angeles, San Diego, Riverside in California, and St. George in Utah. In Manhattan, the military blew up every bridge and tunnel connecting the island to the mainland before bombing the city, trapping whatever walkers and survivors remained on the island. The plan also included clauses authorizing the use of nuclear weapons against metropolitan areas as a last resort. That order was never carried out, reportedly because the nuclear-capable submarines had either been abandoned or had their crews turn. Let that sit for a moment. The United States military came close enough to authorizing nuclear strikes against American cities that the authorization was written into the operational plan. The submarines that would have carried those strikes were lost not to enemy action, but to the internal infection of their own crews. The only thing that stopped the Walking Dead world from being additionally irradiated was that the people who would have launched the missiles died before they could launch them. The napalm bombing is not a minor footnote in The Walking Dead's history. Rick saw the aftermath of Atlanta's bombing when he rode into the city on horseback in the pilot episode. He saw the burns. He saw the abandoned military equipment. He moved through the consequences of Operation Cobalt without knowing what he was looking at. And in The Ones Who Live, released in 2024, it was finally confirmed explicitly. Rick tells Major General Beale that he witnessed Atlanta being napalmed, and Beale reveals that the man standing in front of Rick, Lieutenant Colonel Donald Okafor, was one of the pilots who flew those bombing runs. Donald Okafor's story is one of the most important threads in The Walking Dead's military history, and it took 14 years of the franchise's existence to tell it fully. He was a United States Air Force pilot who participated in Operation Cobalt, dropping napalm on Atlanta and then on Los Angeles. He was following orders. He was doing what the chain of command required. And somewhere in the process of doing it, he made a decision that changed the shape of what came next. When the military turned its attention to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, something different happened. The Pennsylvania National Guard refused to comply with Operation Cobalt. They chose to defend Philadelphia rather than abandon it, and they chose to defend it from the federal forces ordered to bomb it. This internal conflict, which has been referred to in the law as the Second Civil War, was the military turning on itself. National Guard units that had been cooperating with federal forces now found themselves in direct armed conflict with those forces over whether to destroy a city full of surviving civilians. Okafor made his choice in this context. He flew his aircraft not toward Philadelphia to bomb it, but toward the 4,000 Marines who had been sent in to liquidate the survivors. He bombed his own side. He bombed the Marines who had been ordered to kill the people of Philadelphia in order to prevent exactly what he was preventing by doing it. As a result, Philadelphia was not bombed. The Civic Republic of Philadelphia, which would eventually become the most powerful surviving civilization in the Walking Dead universe, survived because one pilot decided that the chain of command had issued an order that no pilot should follow. His wife Estelle, a Marine, was among the troops sent to liquidate the survivors of the Atlanta bombing. She was part of the operation designed to ensure that no one survived what her husband had dropped on the city. The Walking Dead's story of the military's failure is also, at the individual human level, the story of what that failure asked ordinary people to do and what some of them refused when it came down to it. Okafor survived, joined the CRM, became one of its founding figures, and spent years trying to build something from the ruins of the institution he had watched destroy itself. His backstory, revealed in The Ones Who Live, is the most complete portrait the franchise has offered of what it felt like to be inside the military during Operation Cobalt. The institutional pressure to comply, the moral fracture when compliance became impossible, and the attempt to build something better afterward, complicated by the fact that the CRM itself carried some of the same institutional failures the original military had carried. Even setting aside the intelligence failures, the logistics collapse, and the desertion crisis, the military was facing a tactical problem that its entire doctrine was not designed to solve. The United States military in the Walking Dead world had been built, trained, equipped, and structured for one specific purpose: defeating organised human adversaries. Armies, insurgencies, terrorist networks, nation-states. Opponents who had logistics chains of their own that could be disrupted, command structures that could be decapitated, strategic assets that could be targeted, and human psychology that created vulnerabilities that military and intelligence operations could exploit. None of those things applied to the Walker threat. Walkers do not have logistics. They do not have a supply chain that can be cut, a fuel source that can be denied, a food supply that can be interdicted. They exist independently of any infrastructure. They do not need to eat in the conventional sense. They will function without nutrition for extraordinarily long periods. They do not need water. They do not need warmth. The environmental conditions that constrain the operations of living military forces have no equivalent effect on the dead. Walkers do not have a command structure. There is no headquarters to bomb, no general to capture, no chain of communication to intercept and disrupt. A military doctrine built around targeting leadership and command nodes has nothing to target when the adversary has no leadership and no command nodes. Walkers cannot be intimidated. Psychological operations, which are a significant component of modern military strategy, have no application against an opponent that does not experience fear. Walkers cannot be negotiated with. They cannot be persuaded to change sides. They cannot be bribed or threatened or incentivized in any way that changes their behavior. Every tool in the military's doctrine for ending a conflict without total annihilation of the adversary is inapplicable. And then there is the mathematics of the headshot requirement. Military training in the Walking Dead world was not conducted with headshots as the primary objective. A soldier trained on conventional doctrine fires for center mass, maximizing the probability of hits on a moving target and maximizing the physiological stopping effect of each round. Against a walker, center mass rounds do not stop the threat unless they hit the spine at a specific location. Every other hit is ineffective. The military did not know this in the early days of the outbreak. Soldiers were expending ammunition at rates calculated for conventional opponents against targets that required a completely different firing approach that most of them had never trained for. Den of Geek ran a detailed breakdown of this math that is worth understanding. One tank firing at maximum effectiveness under ideal conditions could eliminate roughly 55,000 walkers before running out of ammunition, assuming perfect accuracy. The population of New York City alone was 8.4 million people at the time. The military did not have the ammunition production capacity, let alone the logistical capacity, to distribute it, to close that gap through direct fire. The numbers simply did not work, and they did not work before the supply chains collapsed and made the question of ammunition resupply academic. Robert Kirkman himself addressed this in the letter column of Walking Dead Deluxe issue 75. A fan pointed out that with the biggest armed forces in the world, military survivors should be a much more visible presence in the story. Kirkman's response was that the military had been on the front lines and had suffered catastrophic losses because they did not understand what they were fighting. He confirmed explicitly that the military was never going to show up in large numbers in the story, not because it had been conveniently written out, but because the tactical situation had destroyed it before the story's present day begins. The key insight in Kirkman's explanation, and in the franchise's own lore, is the reanimation problem specifically. Every soldier who died in combat became an additional threat. There was no concept of acceptable casualties in this fight because there were no dead casualties. There were only dead soldiers who had just changed sides. A unit that lost 10% of its personnel in a conventional engagement had lost 10% of its fighting strength. A unit that lost 10% of its personnel in a Walker engagement had lost 10% of its fighting strength and gained 10% additional adversaries in its immediate vicinity. The tactical math of every engagement was inverted from everything the military's doctrine assumed. The military's deployment into major cities was not just strategically questionable, it was, in the specific context of the Walker threat, a near guarantee of catastrophic losses. Urban warfare is the most costly form of combat for any military under any circumstances. The dense physical environment eliminates the advantages of firepower and mobility that modern militaries depend on. Tanks are vulnerable in urban terrain. Air support cannot be used at close quarters without killing friendly forces. Communication systems are degraded by building density. Supply lines running through cities are impossible to secure comprehensively. Every building is a potential ambush site. Every alley, a potential choke point. Every floor of every structure, a separate tactical environment that has to be cleared and held. Now take all of those problems and add the specific characteristics of the Walker threat into the urban environment. The roads out of every major city were jammed within hours of the crisis becoming visible to the public. People fleeing created gridlock that made military vehicle movement nearly impossible except on foot. The density of the civilian population in cities meant that the Walker population density in those same cities was immediately catastrophically high. Walkers generated from the background death rate of a dense urban population had nowhere to diffuse to. They accumulated. They gathered in corridors and stairwells and parking structures. They turned every building the military tried to use as a defensive position into a location that was generating new threats from within. The safe zones in cities were structurally not fortifications. They were population centres with military presence. The difference matters. A fortification is designed around the tactical requirements of its defence. A city block that happens to have soldiers in it is designed around the requirements of being a city block, which have nothing to do with defensive military architecture. The walls that made the Alexandria safe zone viable in the main series were exceptional, purpose-built over time by a community that had learned what worked. The ad hoc perimeters thrown up by the Guard in Los Angeles were not Alexandria. They were chain-link fencing around residential neighbourhoods, and they were not going to hold. The decision to concentrate military resources in cities rather than abandoning them and establishing defensible positions in lower density areas is one of the most consequential strategic choices of Operation Cobalt, and it is one that the franchise suggests was made primarily for political rather than tactical reasons. You cannot publicly announce that you're abandoning major cities. You cannot tell the populations of Atlanta and Los Angeles that the plan is to let those cities fall and protect rural and suburban areas instead. The political impossibility of that announcement drove the military into terrain that maximised its exposure to the worst characteristics of the threat it was facing. And then, when the cities became untenable, the solution was to bomb them, which solved the immediate problem of Walker concentration while destroying whatever infrastructure those cities contained and generating the ongoing consequence of having napalmed your own population centres, a consequence Rick Grimes was still living inside years after the fact. The military did not disappear entirely. Pieces of it survived and adapted, and what those pieces became tells you as much about the institutional failure as the collapse itself does. The most significant surviving military entity in the Walking Dead universe is the Civic Republic Military, the CRM. It grew directly from the aftermath of Operation Cobalt and from the communities that military remnants were able to protect in the chaos of the collapse. The Civic Republic of Philadelphia, which survived because Donald Okafor chose to bomb Marines instead of civilians, became the seat of a new civilization that maintained something like genuine military capability for years after the main series takes place. By the time of World Beyond and The Ones Who Live, the CRM has helicopters, disciplined infantry, advanced medical research, and the organisational coherence to run large-scale operations across significant territory. It is, in the Walking Dead universe, the closest thing to a successor state to the United States itself. But the CRM is not the US military continued. It is what happens when military culture, military hierarchy, and military capability are rebuilt around a completely different mission. The CRM does not protect a nation in any recognisable sense. It does not serve an elected government or a constitutional order. It serves the Civic Republic's vision of what civilization should be rebuilt as, and it is willing to be extraordinarily ruthless about that vision, as The Walking Dead, World Beyond, and The Ones Who Live both demonstrate. The CRM destroys communities it deems incompatible with the Civic Republic's future. It conducts operations that would be recognised as atrocities by the standards of the institution it descended from. It is, in some structural ways, more similar to a powerful private army than to a national military, because it is no longer constrained by the legal and ethical frameworks that were supposed to constrain the original. This is worth pausing on because it is The Walking Dead's most pointed argument about what institutions become when the checks on them are removed. The CRM has the capability that the original military had, but it has lost the accountability. The US military, for all its failures in the outbreak, was theoretically answerable to the civilian government, to Congress, to the courts, to the Constitution. The CRM is answerable to itself and to its own vision of the future. The military that failed to save civilization was constrained by the structures of that civilization. The military successor that survived its failure has no such constraints, and the Walking Dead universe treats that as exactly as dangerous as it sounds. Smaller remnants of the military persisted in different forms across the Walking Dead world. The soldiers at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, who Rick's group encounters in Season 5, are former military and police who have built a brutal forced labour system around a hospital. They retained military organisation and some military equipment, but have repurposed both entirely away from any original mission, using them to maintain personal power over the civilians they have captured and coerced. Officer Dawn Lerner runs what is essentially a fiefdom with medical services, built on the logic that she and her people save people's lives by pulling them from the street, and those people now owe her a debt that can only be repaid in labour. The institution's structure, without the institution's purpose, becomes a mechanism for exploitation. This is a pattern that repeats across the franchise in different forms, the shape of authority persisting after the authority's legitimacy has been lost. Individual military survivors appear throughout the franchise in various forms, some having integrated into survivor communities and contributed their training and skills, others having become exactly the kind of threat that they were once supposed to protect people from. What almost none of them are doing is anything recognisable as the original mission of the institution they came from. The helicopter Rick sees on his hospital roof at the beginning of the story, the 7th Cavalry markings on the abandoned Huey he passes in the early episodes, the abandoned military checkpoints, the stripped vehicles, the riot gear turning up as scavenged equipment in various communities years after the collapse. These are the material remains of an institution that was enormously powerful and went away very fast. Characters throughout the main series encounter military equipment in the same state Rick encounters it in the pilot. abandoned, often empty of ammunition, often with the original operator dead nearby. The weapons that were supposed to save the world became the scavenged inventory of its survivors. There's also the matter of military installations that the franchise gestures toward, but never fully resolves. Edwards Air Force Base in California was listed as one of the expected evacuation points for military personnel during the Cobalt withdrawal. What happened there is never shown in detail. The implication from the lore is that it was overrun at some point, either through Walker pressure or through the collapse of the supply chains keeping it operational. The most sophisticated military infrastructure in human history, installations designed to survive nuclear attack, could not survive the logistical and human consequences of a viral outbreak that turned every death into an additional adversary. What the military left behind in the world of The Walking Dead is not just the hardware. It is the psychological and social legacy of what it did in its final weeks. Every survivor who was in a safe zone and watched the military leave in the night without warning carries that experience forward. Every person who heard the napalm drop on Atlanta or Los Angeles or any of the other cities knows that the institution they had trusted with their protection made a decision to protect its own assets rather than its stated mission. The Commonwealth arc of the final seasons is partly about what it looks like when a new generation tries to build a large-scale civilization with that legacy in the background, tries to build something that the people inside it can actually trust, and runs into all the same pressures that broke the trust in the first place. The Walking Dead themselves, the walkers that fill every street and field and building, in the franchise's world, are in some meaningful sense the military's most lasting inheritance. Not because the military created the virus, but because the military's decision to bomb cities rather than clear them methodically concentrated enormous numbers of the dead in urban centres, destroyed the infrastructure that would have made those concentrations manageable, and scattered the surviving civilian population across a landscape that now had no institutional support of any kind. The walkers in Atlanta in Season 1 are there in part because the military chose to bomb Atlanta instead of abandoning it cleanly. The world Rick wakes up into is not just a natural consequence of the virus spreading. It is the shaped consequence of a series of institutional decisions about how to respond to the virus, decisions made by people who are trying to do the right thing with incomplete information and failing badly in ways that compounded with every hour. Here is the thing that makes The Walking Dead's military failure genuinely tragic rather than just strategically interesting. The military could have survived. The collapse was not inevitable from the first day of the outbreak. The conditions that made it possible to survive, to hold territory, to protect communities, were demonstrated by small groups of people with far fewer resources across the entire run of the franchise. The prison, Alexandria, the hilltop, the kingdom. Communities of dozens or hundreds of people, working with whatever materials they could find, who figured out how to build walls, clear perimeters, establish watch rotations, manage internal threats, maintain food production, and defend against both walker hordes and human aggression. None of these communities had tanks. None had air support. None had the logistics infrastructure of a national military. But they functioned. Some of them thrived, for years at a time. What those communities had that the military's initial response did not was accurate information about the nature of the threat. They knew that the dead rose. They knew the headshot requirement. They knew that the perimeter had to be maintained continuously, that the threat did not diminish when you weren't watching it, that there was no off switch and no negotiated peace and no deal to be made. They had adapted their tactics, their architecture, and their daily routines to the actual characteristics of what they were facing, rather than to a model of the threat that was incomplete. The contrast between military doctrine and survivor community practice is most visible in the question of perimeter design and watch rotation. The military established perimeters around existing urban infrastructure, working with whatever fencing and barriers were immediately available in the environments they were already in. The communities that survived in the long run designed their perimeters from scratch around the specific behavioural characteristics of walkers. They understood that walkers accumulate against barriers rather than searching for ways around them systematically. They understood that noise attracted walkers and built their operations around minimising acoustic signatures during vulnerable periods. They understood that walkers could be cleared methodically from an area in ways that allowed communities to expand without triggering the catastrophic concentrations that had destroyed the military safe zones. This knowledge was paid for in lives. It was developed through trial and error by people with no doctrine to follow and no institutional memory to draw on. It is knowledge the military should have been developing and distributing from its enormous research and institutional infrastructure. Instead, it was being discovered independently by individual survivor groups because the institution had collapsed before it could generate and propagate the right operational model. The tragedy is the sequence. The military deployed first with the most resources and was working from the wrong model. The communities that survived figured out the right model but had almost no resources. If the institutional knowledge that eventually developed in communities like Alexandria had been available to military planners in the first weeks of the outbreak, if the information about what the virus actually was and what the dead actually did had been distributed to field commanders instead of being controlled at the top, the outcome was not necessarily as catastrophic as it became. Robert Kirkman's confirmation that the military was on the front lines and took catastrophic losses because it did not understand what it was fighting is the clearest statement of this. It is not that the military was weak. It is that the military strength was deployed in ways that matched the wrong model of the threat. And by the time enough people understood what the right model was, the military no longer had the resources or the command coherence to apply it. The military helicopter on the roof of Rick's hospital is one of the most carefully chosen images in The Walking Dead's opening episode. It is there to show you the scale of what happened while Rick was unconscious. The most powerful institution in the country arrived, assessed the situation, and left. Not because it was defeated in the conventional sense, but because it found itself in a situation that its entire doctrine, its entire training, its entire institutional identity had not prepared it for. The intelligence failure, the cover-up that kept the critical information about wildfire away from the field commanders who needed it most, the logistics collapse that turned expensive military hardware into expensive deadweight, the desertion crisis that converted morale resources into human beings walking away from their posts in the dark, the tactical impossibility of urban deployment against a threat that converted casualties into additional adversaries, the political impossibility of honest communication with the public about what was actually happening, the decision to bomb cities rather than admit that the safe zone strategy had failed, the internal fracture between National Guard units defending Philadelphia and federal forces ordered to destroy it, producing a second civil war at the exact moment when unified command was most critical. Each one of those failures fed into the next. Each decision that was made with the information available made the next decision harder and the next set of options worse. Operation Cobalt was not the plan of a military that had given up on its mission. It was the plan of an institution trying to salvage something from a situation that had already moved past the point of salvage, making the only moves available to it, even when those moves were terrible, even when they involved bombing Atlanta and abandoning the people in the safe zones in the dark, and asking soldiers to do things that soldiers should not be asked to do. The people who designed Cobalt were not monsters. They were people who had run out of good options and were choosing between bad ones, and they chose the options that preserved the institution at the cost of the mission. That is a choice that institutions have made before. It is usually called a strategic retreat. In this case, it was the end. Donald Okafor spent the rest of his life trying to figure out what it meant to have done what he did, and to have survived when so many did not. His choice to bomb the Marines in Pennsylvania rather than Philadelphia is the single most heroic act in The Walking Dead's military history. And it is an act of institutional treason. A commissioned officer turning his weapons on his own forces to save the people they were ordered to kill. He could not follow the order because the order was wrong. In following that logic, he stepped outside the chain of command that had defined his entire adult life. What he built afterward, the CRM role he eventually occupied, was his attempt to construct the thing the military should have been, an institution with the capability to protect civilization that also retained the values that made protection meaningful. Whether he succeeded is a question the ones who live answers with considerable ambiguity. The Walking Dead themselves, those endless, patient, impossible figures filling every street and field in the franchise, are in some ways the military's most lasting monument. Not because the military created the virus, but because the military's choices shaped the landscape of the dead. The bombing of Atlanta, of Los Angeles, of those other cities did not kill the walkers in them. Napalm burns, it does not destroy brains. The bombing concentrated, scattered, and to some extent amplified the walker populations in every city it targeted, and it destroyed the infrastructure that would have made those populations manageable in the years that followed. The walkers Rick moves through in the Atlanta streets are there in part because of Operation Cobalt. The world he wakes up into is not just a natural consequence of a virus. It is the product of decisions made by frightened, good faith, overwhelmed people in the weeks before Rick opened his eyes. That is the story of what the military was and what it became and what it left behind. One of the most powerful institutions in human history, fielding the most advanced military technology ever built, brought down not by a rival, but by a problem it was never designed to solve. And information it was never given in time to matter. There is a great deal more to explore in the Walking Dead universe, and we will get to all of it. For now, get some rest.